I actually want to talk about IoT today and security and some recent work we've been doing, both looking at what IoT devices are actually in real world homes and as well as some of the recent attacks that we've seen in this space. And there's been all this talk actually in the security community recently about how IoT is going to be like our demise. Right, like all of these IoT devices are terrible and they're going to have privacy problems and everything's going to be terrible in the future. And we've really been focusing on these like very new IoT devices come out. We see these attacks against like home doorbells. And we see devices against these IoT devices where I at least thought like, who on earth would ever buy these devices? Like maybe they have security problems, but like, do we care? Are these devices in people's homes? And for the most part, we actually really didn't know what IoT devices were in anybody's homes. We like to do these very large scans of the entire internet where we look at the devices on every public IP address to see what's out there. But most of these IoT devices are inside of homes. They're behind home routers, which act as a firewall. And so we actually don't see most of these devices on the public internet. We don't, for the most part, have a good sense of what IoT devices consumers have actually purchased, if they've purchased any at all. And so we recently paired up with Avast Antivirus, who is primarily an antivirus company, surprise. But they have this interesting feature in their product called Wi-Fi Inspector. And they've effectively built in like a network vulnerability scanner into their antivirus product. And so it says you install antivirus on your product, but then you can scan the rest of your network for other machines that might be infected. And so we actually partnered with Avast to say, what IoT devices are they seeing inside of people's homes? Because these laptops and these desktops that are running this antivirus software are on the inside. They're on that home network. And so they have, when they do a scan, they actually see what IoT devices are connected to Wi-Fi, that are plugged in, that have an IP address. So we partnered with Avast, and they have about 300 million customers that are worldwide, and about 55 million have used this product called Wi-Fi Inspector. They've done one of these vulnerability scans on their local network, and about 16 million of those homes actually agreed to share their data for research purposes. So we have what looks like a vulnerability scan of the inside of about 16 million homes from December of last year. And you might say, okay, like, are these 16 million homes representative of people who would have IoT devices or not? And there's likely some bias in this data, but it's actually probably not towards what you'd expect. Actually, the people that are running like Windows machines and running antivirus today oftentimes are not the most kind of technically advanced users. So there is some bias, but if I asked everyone in this room today, which of you have a Windows machine and have installed free antivirus, I bet the number is like 0. Computer scientists don't go and do this. It tends to be more average home users. They've got this with their computer. They got spyware and they went off and they installed this product. So we have 16 million homes that we're going to look at. And I actually think what surprised me the most, this is just looking at the percentage of homes that have at least one IoT device. And I came into this study just thinking, you know, no one uses IoT. This is kind of this almost made up phenomenon that we're worried about. And actually, in the US, about 2/3 of homes have some sort of embedded device on their network today. And I thought this was going to be some minuscule fraction, but it's about 2/3 in North America. It's close in Western Europe. And even globally, about 1 out of 3 homes have some sort of device that is an embedded server, that is an IoT device, which is kind of interesting. I think you might be asking, okay, like, well, what are you calling an IoT device? Like, what's our definition there? And really what we're looking at is that anything that's not a mobile phone or a computer, something that is some sort of small embedded device that's running Linux, that has some embedded network stack. So in just globally, let me scroll up a little bit, what IoT looks like actually varies tremendously between regions in the world. If you look at North America, the majority of IoT devices are actually televisions. So in North America, most people watch TV today through Netflix, through Hulu, through these other streaming providers. And so for the most part, we're seeing a lot of like Roku devices, or we're seeing TVs from LG, from Samsung. But it's actually quite difficult today to get a TV that does not have network connectivity. That is the default today if you go and you buy a television. And so all of these are sitting on home networks, and all of them have a network stack. They're all running Linux, more or less. The next thing we also see are networks like printers and scanners. So more and more of these networks today have a network stack. They connect to Wi-Fi. This was something we saw in enterprise networks maybe 5, 10 years ago. But again, today, most printers connect over Wi-Fi. It's kind of a similar story in Europe. In Western Europe, we see actually a larger majority that are televisions. We actually see a little bit fewer game consoles than we see in North America. But again, mostly kind of media devices. Again, these aren't, if you look at which ones of these are actually like what we think of as like an IoT device, a generic, or sorry, like home automation, which is things like these doorbells. It's actually this like tiny fraction of the devices that are. And in most regions, none of these devices are those types of things. If you look at Southeast Asia, you actually see a very different picture. Almost all of the IoT devices in Southeast Asia are surveillance cameras. So we don't see this dominance of media devices or printers. We see these cameras. Now say I stepped too far. OK. So IoT's here. It looks very different. But it really is here. If you look at it, more than 40% of homes today have, in the US, have a television that's networked. Yep.
And how do you know they're homes?
So this is a good question. We can tell oftentimes by the shape of the network that there is one like single home router, that it is a private subnet. Windows actually also asks when you connect to a network for the first time, are you connecting to a public network or are you connecting to your home? And we can use that data as well. So we don't have a 100% guarantee that these are homes, and some of these might also be like small home office kind of setups where they have 5 machines and a printer. But we're not going to be seeing these on like large enterprise networks where people are getting publicly addressable IP addresses. That make sense?
Yeah, I was just thinking with the surveillance cameras, maybe we're getting some shops or something.
Yeah, no, it's very possible that you have, I mean, a shop in many ways might look like a home. It's kind of one computer and a home router and maybe a device. It's kind of hard to distinguish between those situations.
In Brazil, I have a friend who worked in selling home automation stuff. In Brazil, it's mostly security cameras.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's like the main thing people wanted was security.
Yeah, and we'll actually get, Brazil's kind of interesting. They actually look very similar to Southeast Asia and later in this talk. But yeah, I guess the big takeaway here is like IoT is actually here. And for the security folks, we're talking about the wrong devices. We should not be worried about, it's not that we shouldn't be worried. We should not be paying all of our attention to the Nests and these doorbells. We really need to be saying what are all of these kind of more boring devices we haven't been paying attention to that actually probably have much larger security ramifications for users than these brand new kind of shiny devices that aren't actually being adopted. But the problem's here today too, right? This isn't a problem for a future. If we say, look, the majority of homes in some regions now have one of these devices, we really do need to be looking at solutions that are applicable today. I think one of the kind of interesting ones, this was interesting to me because in the US, we've seen these voice assistants come out a lot. Alexa's and Google, is it Google Home, have made a large, 10% of homes now have one. But we've really not seen adoption anywhere else. For the most part, though, this is also kind of what we see when we see new types of devices come out, as we start to see more adoption in the US. And then we see in other Western nations that kind of comes with it later on. It might not make it to parts of like Asia. But for the most part, we start to see this trend where things first become popular in North America and then kind of other regions start to pick them up. OK. So one of the things we were just interested in looking at as well was not just are devices present, but what security problems are there. And we can do this because we actually are doing vulnerability scans inside of people's homes. We can't, when we go out and we scan the internet, we can't actually try to log into everyone's device. But if you're trying to scan the devices that you own, we can. We can actually attempt to like check for vulnerabilities. We can check for default usernames and passwords. And I'm only going to present some of the numbers about credentials because they're not manufacturer specific. But kind of takeaway here is this is looking at the number of protocols, number of devices that are running FTP. So FTP is a protocol I think we all thought was kind of deprecated. We'd moved on. We said, look, we shouldn't be using this insecure protocol. But in a lot of cases, we're seeing 20, 30% of devices in some categories that are running these protocols still. They've actually made a comeback, and we're seeing them on quite a few devices.
You know why?
It's simple to implement. It's kind of interesting. And again, so I'll kind of come up in the second part of the talk. We're seeing the same evolution happen in many ways of what happened in the desktop space, just happening again in the mobile space. So these are much more constrained devices. They tend to use simpler protocols. They are tending to do things like use Telnet and FTP instead of SSH. Because SSH is a much larger library, it's more complex to deploy correctly. What's interesting is we actually see the same thing happening kind of in the malware and attack side as well, where we've seen kind of us move back a couple decades and then more quickly kind of evolve in the same way that desktop computers have. But we're seeing, again, tens of percentages of devices that are running these protocols at all. And in some cases, we're seeing up to like 30% of these that actually allow logins using default credentials. So the very kind of bare minimum security that we'd expect, we're not seeing. And we see the same thing for even the HTTP logins. We see that in a lot of cases for like home routers. That's about half of the home routers still have guessable usernames and passwords for these login interfaces. Okay. So we've been talking about, look, these devices have problems, but they're all on the inside of homes. And there's kind of this point to be made of like, do we really care that your home router has a default username and password? Do we really care that your IoT device has a default username and password if it's on the inside of your home? Right? It's protected from attackers who are going off and scanning the internet for these devices. I think one interesting way to kind of look at this is to say, well, how are desktop resources used by attackers? Because desktop resources are also behind these home routers. They're behind these home NATs. But we have seen this evolution of attacks against these devices. And if you look at today, the resources on desktops that get compromised are very heavily commoditized. So someone will take over a device, and then they sell off different kind of assets on that device for use. So they'll sell off bandwidth for denial of service attacks. They'll sell off the IP reputation for sending spam. They'll use CPU cycles actually mostly for mining cryptocurrencies today, for mining Bitcoin. They'll use it to steal data, and then eventually, kind of as the last step, they'll install ransomware and use it to essentially try to get back any money that they can once all these other resources are used up. What's kind of interesting is that you can imagine in this parallel space in the IoT world that these same types of attacks would occur. You can imagine that the bandwidth actually on your home router is actually very interesting because it has access to the same bandwidth as the desktop computer behind the home router. The IP reputation is similar, right? Your home router has the same reputation as the computer behind it. It has a little bit of CPU cycles, but it's on 24/7. And it does also have this read and write access to some data that's going by. It may not be like credit cards, because those are going over HTTPS, but it might be like the video actually on that surveillance camera or on the video from inside of your home. So you can imagine that even if these devices are behind a home network, if they do get infected, there are resources that are interesting to them. And so the second part I think that's a little more interesting is how is this actually played out in the real world? And I actually want to go back to, this is December 2016. There was a significant attack that really affected most of the eastern seaboard in the US that took down a number of popular websites. So for most of the day in December, I think it was December 16th, Twitter and Amazon and Netflix and all these websites were completely inaccessible to users. And when this happened, there's actually this, there's a huge amount of kind of drama and these kind of guesses for what were happening, where people are saying, oh, this is the first major kind of cyber war attack we've seen against the US. And there are all kind of these big speculations about what was going on. And what actually happened was that it wasn't anonymous, or it wasn't a nation state attacking the US. What actually happened was that a single DNS provider called Dyn actually came under a denial of service attack. And so there's one company that was targeted by this attack, and all these other websites like Twitter and Amazon and everyone else used Dyn as their DNS provider. So essentially, the DNS for all these major websites went down, and when that happened, none of these sites were accessible. So there was this big denial of service attack against Dyn. But it was actually the third attack in a series of 4 that we saw that looked very different than all the other denial of service attacks we'd seen on the internet. So this is where it really hit public, kind of came to public eye. But in September of 2016, there's actually an attack against OVH, a large cloud provider. There was another big attack against Brian Krebs, who is a security researcher. And then eventually, there's actually an attack against this Liberian ISP that actually took most of the country offline. So there's these 4 denial of service attacks that looked different than prior denial of service attacks we'd seen. And there's kind of 2 ways these look different. The first off was actually, this was the largest denial of service attack we'd ever seen. It was about twice as large as any other attacks we had seen on the public internet. And so all of a sudden, just the amount of pure bandwidth that was available had doubled that we had ever seen. And I think this took a lot of people by surprise. There kind of been this increasing growth, but overnight, double the bandwidth that's being used for these attacks. The second difference was that we had gotten very used to seeing denial of service attacks that happened through what we call amplification. And so you would buy a small server in a cloud provider. You'd spoof a UDP packet as the victim, and you'd send it to an open DNS resolver or an open NTP provider whose reply would be much, much larger than the original query. So a bot, someone who had rented out maybe a gigabit of bandwidth would be able to amplify oftentimes 60 or 70 times the amount of bandwidth they had for the attack. And so you didn't actually have to have too much resources to pull off a major attack. You could get a couple of these servers, and you were able to bring about a couple hundred gigabits of bandwidth of attack. And this is what we've been used to seeing. And we've been used to seeing it because it was very convenient, right? It was very cheap to do this. You only have to buy one small server to have this large punch. What was different about the attack that we saw against these websites, this 600 gigabit attack, was that we didn't see any amplification at all. What we had seen were a large number of requests that were coming directly from IP addresses. So it was things like a host sending a TLS handshake or sending an HTTP GET request. But we are seeing a scale of these that was much, much larger than anything we'd ever seen before. But it was all organic traffic. And the other thing that was different was that all of this organic traffic was actually coming from IoT devices. They were coming from IP addresses that we had never seen attack traffic or really any traffic on the internet from before. So we had this new set of IP addresses that these cloud providers like Akamai and Cloudflare were seeing for the first time. And it was about 200,000 IoT devices that are actually being used to carry out these attacks. So all of these devices were actually compromised by a piece of malware called Mirai. And the Mirai malware is kind of your prototypical really simple, dumb piece of malware. So what would happen was a device would become infected, and it would just randomly start scanning for devices on port 23, which is Telnet. And it would find a victim that had port 23 open, and it would try to log in with about 10 default usernames and passwords. At which point, it would say, look, this victim is infected, and it would or this machine can be infected. It would send up this IP address to kind of the command and control server. And then later on, a loader would come, and it would dispatch a job to load malware onto this victim machine. Now, this was probably the worst piece of malware worst written piece of malware we'd ever seen. Interestingly, there are a bunch of just really sloppy mistakes. For example, like they got the end.
Sorry, how does this work through a home NAT or firewall?
Yeah, so in this case, it would be like the home router that was being infected, or if the surveillance camera actually had a public IP address. And I'll come back and kind of bridge these two spaces in a bit. But these are like home routers and video cameras that are directly on the internet here. But this malware was terribly written. I think the funniest one was they actually, for some reason, they had this rule where they didn't want to scan any IP addresses that belonged to the US Post Office. And we don't actually know why they were trying to avoid the US Post Office. But they got the endianness of like the IP addresses wrong. And so they were actually just skipping every like IP address that ended in .23. And so they just skipped 1 out of 256 like random IP addresses. Their like random number generator didn't actually have coverage over the full IP space. It would just miss chunks of it. There was a bunch of like buffer overflows where if they found too many hosts too quickly, they would like crash and they would lose them. So this was like, it looked like a piece of malware that was written by like a high school student. And it actually really threw us off in the beginning. We had gotten really used to seeing like very well packaged malware. And in the beginning, we actually thought we were just really bad at like taking this apart, that like we were misunderstanding what they were doing. And it was like, no, it's actually just truly a terribly written piece of code. But despite this looking like the most simple pieces of malware, it was able to take over quite a few devices. And the reason actually I think that it was able to take over so many devices was that it was so simple. They didn't actually go after any manufacturers. They didn't actually go after any vulnerabilities specifically. All they did was they would try to log in over Telnet. They'd run pkill, try to kill this web server or something else, and then they'd SCP over a binary and run it. And so because they took this really simple approach of just running a few kind of bash commands, they managed to write a piece of malware that affected almost all IoT devices. Because what all of these IoT devices had in common was that they all had these small embedded Linux servers. And so this piece of malware worked on all of these different devices because it was so dead simple. So Mirai was able to take over about 200 to 300,000 devices. And we can actually tell how large Mirai was because in the way they were scanning, they actually like designed their packets incorrectly so that they were very easily identifiable. And so we can actually see when they first kind of come out, and this happens around August of 2016. And we actually see this first scanner that kind of does like a bootstrapping scan. And this is actually a scanner that's running from a hosting provider in Pennsylvania. And this will come back later. So we see this cloud provider that's starting to scan. It's starting to do this bootstrap scan. And then after about 4 hours of this bootstrap scan running, we see the rest of the botnet essentially start to scan. So the botnet operator sends out a command that says, OK, all of my little bots, go off and scan for other victims. So at 4 a.m., we start to see all these other bots come online. By 24 hours in, there's about 65,000 devices that have been compromised and are scanning for other devices to take over and use for attacks.
Quick question, so the compromising measure because you see that they are scanning, so that could be compromised not scanning?
It's possible. The malware was written in a way such that until you got an attack command, you would be scanning. And so it's possible, but really we would expect, just based how this initial piece of malware was written, that they were all scanning when they became infected. Okay. So we're at about 65,000 devices by the end of the day. And the steady state of Mirai is somewhere around 200 to 300,000 devices. We see as time goes on, they start to add kind of additional protocols. So in the beginning, they're just starting to scan Telnet. Later on, they add in SSH and start scanning that. Eventually here, we see this big peak because they actually go after a vulnerability in CWMP, which is a protocol that ISPs use to manage like cable modems at people's houses. It's a customer premise kind of management protocol. So we see actually these are all kind of cable modems in a kind of a handful of different ISPs. But then those ISPs catch on, they actually patch those cable modems, and you start to see this kind of natural decay when people restart their cable modems because they don't work. And it kind of comes back to this kind of steady state of a couple 100,000 devices. Okay. So we have somewhere about 200 to 300,000 devices. And we actually have a pretty good idea of what these devices are, because if they were compromised, it meant they were listening on the public internet. And so they had some sort of login screen that said, hey, look, I'm like a Netgear home router, or I'm a camera. And a lot of these had logins that were running on Telnet or on SSH or on HTTP. And so we could take the data we had from these very large internet-wide scans and kind of correlate that with the devices that we saw scanning for victims, and actually get a good sense of the types of devices that were infected. And for the ones that we can detect this for, by far the most were cameras and DVRs or home routers. And this starts to come into Brazil and Southeast Asia a bit here. But really, they just went after these first two categories. And that was mostly just defined on the set of usernames and passwords that they seeded with. So we can actually look in the malware itself and see that they're using, some of these are really, we have no idea like what they belong to, because it's just like admin, admin, or admin guest, things like that. But in the cases where there are passwords that are static but have been like documented in a manual, we can figure out what devices they were going after. And this matches up pretty well with the types of devices that we actually see infected. Most of them are either IP cameras or kind of home routers. But like not a ton of passwords here, not a ton of like really creative passwords here. We really kind of took a dump of, I think probably if you Google default passwords for some devices, what you're going to pick up. Okay. So who did Mirai go after? So we mentioned that they went after this Liberian ISP and Dyn and Krebs and OVH. Those weren't the only targets. There are actually quite a few different sites we see attacked. And if you look at this list, you might be thinking, like, what on earth does this set of services have to do with each other? Right? Like, there's Russian like cooking blogs. There's Italian like websites for politicians. There's Akamai and OVH, which are like very, very large multinational providers. It's kind of all over the place. And so we've been staring at this list thinking, okay, are there clusters? What does this look like? And the reality is most of these have nothing to do with each other. And the reason why was that after the authors of the original malware started their botnet, they panicked and they decided to post the actual malware online. So they went into one of these kind of hacker forums and they posted the piece of malware up there and they said, hey everyone, it's free, it's yours, go at it. And you might be saying, like, why on earth would you do this? You wrote this piece of malware, you put this work in, you control hundreds of thousands of devices. Why would you then go publish it for everyone else to use? That's somewhat counterproductive. We actually see this happen when people panic. And the idea is that they don't want to be caught with the piece of malware. If everyone has the piece of malware, they look equally as culpable as everyone else. And so this is not necessarily a well thought out approach, but something we do see happen from time to time when people really get in over their heads. They try to just give it to the rest of the world and hope that they kind of disappear into the noise. Okay. So at this point now, everyone has a copy of the malware. And so what starts to happen is that the malware starts to evolve. So the version in August, I said, is like this really dumb, simple approach. They just compile this binary, they SCP it over, and they hope for the best. What we start to see happen is that we see what happened in like the last decade of desktop malware happen within like a 3-month span within the IoT space. So we start to see this evolution where they remove the IP address-based command and control and they start to use domain-based. They start to introduce like domain generation algorithms such that if a domain is taken down, that they stay up. We start to see these binaries be packed. We start to see new sets of vulnerabilities, new sets of passwords. We really see all of these tricks that occurred in the desktop space happen. And we can kind of track actually how these pieces evolve over time. Because every time that when Mirai goes to infect someone, they copy the piece of malware up to those machines. And so by putting honeypots out there that just look like they're vulnerable Telnet or SSH devices, we get a copy of each piece of malware, and we can see this evolution occur over time. And we can see that at times people share. At times we just see evolution within kind of the same variant, but this evolution's occurring. And so we can also look at where each of these pieces of malware connects for commands. So each of these pieces of malware connects back to a command and control server to say, what should I do? Who should I attack? What should I scan for? What should I do next? And so we can take all of these variants and we can see who they are connecting to for commands. And when we do that, we start to see a couple of distinct clusters that come out, which are effectively independent operators of different variants of this malware. And so the original piece of malware here is cluster 1, and that is the one that really is going after Krebs and OVH. But then later on, these other attacks that happen against these other sites are actually operated by independent parties. And so we wouldn't really expect there to be much overlap between these Russian blogs and like Krebs, because they probably have nothing to do with each other. Okay. I mean, you might still be saying, okay, but what's a Russian blog and like an Italian politician have to do with each other? Those still seem fairly disparate. And what we saw was that a lot of these are actually being run by booter services, or you put up a website and you essentially say, pay me Bitcoin and I will DDoS someone for you. So there's this kind of open black market where you can pay for DDoS attacks against your competitors, against the other chef you don't like. And so what we see is that for some of these other clusters, these start to get used by these booter operators. And so anyone who pays a Bitcoin might end up in one of these clusters, and that's what we see, is we see these kind of random looking sets of targets. Okay. Now this makes sense, again, for like the blogs, maybe for this auction site, maybe for Brian Krebs. It doesn't still really make sense necessarily for like Dyn or OVH, right? These are like a large multinational company. Like, why is someone going to pay on one of these sites to take down OVH, right? Like, it doesn't quite make sense from people who are just paying a Bitcoin to take their competitors offline. Okay. So the sad news is that actually the reason is Minecraft. It's Minecraft and gaming servers. So there's this underground ecosystem where people will blackmail the operators of Minecraft servers and say, we're going to DOS you unless you pay us. And the users of Minecraft servers, when a Minecraft server goes like down, are very quick to migrate to another server. And so if you're offline for a couple of hours, you lose all of your customers. And so it's led to this market where people blackmail other Minecraft operators for a couple of Bitcoin. And then if they don't pay, they DOS them. So OVH happened to be hosting a fair number of Minecraft servers. The IP addresses we actually see scanning aren't like OVH infrastructure. They're Minecraft servers that are being hosted on OVH. Why did Dyn go down? Dyn actually went down because of DDoS attacks against PlayStation's name servers. These are people trying to get upper hand in a game. And if you DOSed these name servers and you knew when that name server was going to be DOSed, you might get ahead in the game. So the reality is that Amazon and Netflix and Twitter and everyone went offline, not because there was any attack against them, but because people are trying to get ahead at a PlayStation game. And that took down the internet for most of these major providers. Okay. So Brian Krebs actually was a similar one. Brian Krebs had recently written a blog post about one of the operators of these booter services, these services where you could buy a DDoS attack for a Bitcoin. And the friends of the person so Brian Krebs wrote this article and essentially identified who one of these major operators was, and then this operator was arrested. And the operator's friends were angry. They were really angry that their friend had been arrested, and so they decided to go after Brian Krebs' blog. But they're mostly just angry that their kind of co-conspirator had been arrested. Okay. So if you can't tell, like, we've painted this picture of, okay, we're going after Minecraft servers, and we're going after PlayStation servers, and this looks like the worst written piece of malware out there. This isn't a large criminal organization that's doing this. The reality is, it's actually 2 students at Rutgers who wrote this piece of malware. And we, They did actually, yes. They were actually arrested for that as well. We actually know this too because remember how we said like way back here that like there's this single like person who was, this is what I get for not having slides. There's this single person scanning in the beginning. Turns out they rented that host with their credit card. Right, and so it doesn't take very long to say, hey, we know what IP address this is, and for a warrant to be issued for that information. There's also a number of other reasons that we knew it was them, because, for example, they actually called Brian Krebs on Skype and told him that they were going to DOS him. And so they actually had like transcripts of these phone calls. And the reason they had built this, this botnet was they were part of this Minecraft racket where they had this, they had a company called ProTraff Solutions, and ProTraff Solutions would offer DDoS protection services against your Minecraft server. Now, the way that their DDoS protection service worked was if you subscribed to their service, then they wouldn't DOS you.
Mafia.
Right. It wasn't that they were protecting you against anyone but themselves. And so they built this botnet, and then they would try to extort these Minecraft operators, and if not, they'd use their botnet of IoT devices to take down your Minecraft server. And it got way out of hand. And then people who are actually good at running these types of operations took over and started to take over all of these IoT devices. So it started as this very simple game for them, but then really got out of hand. So Mirai is actually this somewhat ironic name of, it actually means the future in Japanese. And if we go back to this commoditization of desktop resources, since Mirai happened, we've actually seen all of these different areas start to be taken over for attacks. We've seen now malware that is using bandwidth for DDoS attacks. We're seeing it that's being used for spam. We've seen devices, actually TVs now being have ransomware installed on them. And you have this really interesting point of like, well, again, why do we care if all these devices are behind this home router? And the answer is that IoT devices can just become a commodity that's sold with the infection of a desktop computer, right? So you infect a Windows machine. That person downloaded maybe a PDF that was infected. That malware then scans the rest of that home and can take over the devices on the inside of that home network. And so they might be protected against these large internet-wide scans, but they're not really protected against anyone else because all these home machines are infected already, right? All of these Windows machines have malware on them. And there's nothing that prevents, we've seen for a long time malware that spreads from one desktop machine to another desktop machine. There's no reason that we don't also see malware that spreads from desktop machine to IoT. And maybe from IoT back to desktop machine. And what's really interesting here is that you can take over a home router and use that as your kind of permanent foothold in the network. So the person's desktop may go off and get repaired. It might get something new installed on it. But then they show up back on their home network and they're going to install patches before they do anything. But their home router knows immediately when they come online because they control DHCP. They control that access to the internet. They know what update you're about to go install. And so they know exactly how vulnerable you are. And so by having this foothold in this network, in many ways has enabled like the permanence of malware on these networks. And there's nothing that users can really do except to toss that device. There's no way, though, that they know that device is compromised. There's no way that they have for it to get updates. They have no way to really repair it. And so we've ended up in this ecosystem where what really scares me actually is not the IoT devices as much as all these home routers. We know that none of these are patched. We know that almost all of these have these default usernames and passwords. And I think it's just going to become a next kind of staple within kind of the home ecosystem of infected devices. These kind of results were from two different papers. There are a lot of folks involved. The IoT one is coming out at Usenix this fall. The Mirai one had a lot of folks. This took a lot of data from the folks that were attacked, from operators, from Brian Krebs' web logs, and tried to pull this all together to make kind of a coherent story. And so there's a lot of folks from the law enforcement side up through Brian Krebs that were involved in kind of putting these fragments together. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Practical question. So when you like in this Mirai paper, so how do you, what about the ethics of this? Like, don't you feel afraid? Like, you could be the next attack if you find these things. Like, how do you work with law enforcement?
Yes, you could be, absolutely. And like Brian Krebs has been attacked repeatedly, and he's going after individuals. And he's had his home swatted. He's had, I think he has a problem where he gets kilograms of coke mailed to his house every day. And he just has an agreement at this point with the police that he brings whatever drugs get delivered to his house. And they just have this arrangement. So yeah, there are, especially now that a lot of these attacks are actually controlled by mafias, there is some worry there. I'm not too worried about this specific case because it was kind of a bunch of teenagers. I don't think there's any reason to go after us as individuals. But I do think for some of the researchers in the space, yeah, there is risk. And that's a hard question, right? Brian has a family, right? And how do you balance that with continuing to do that type of investigative journalism?
To what extent are these attackers trying to uncover the honeypots and expose them?
For the most part, we don't see that because it just doesn't matter. We know about their existence, but those devices are already all infected. And so it's pretty easy to look for these honeypots, but we actually don't even see people try to avoid, like, we have large swaths of IP address space where we look at where people are scanning, and we don't see people avoiding those even. And those are whole like /8s, where you'd think they'd actually get a fair amount of like improvement performance-wise from removing those, and we don't see it. There just isn't it's an over-optimization to them, and why bother doing that if there's no reason to? It's just, it hasn't happened.
So it kind of goes with the amateurism.
Yeah, right. All of these things kind of evolve by need. Right, it's like you get your C2 domain taken down, so you figure out a better solution for that. But all of this evolves kind of as an ad-needed basis.
I might have missed it, but how did you realize the motivations behind those attacks? I mean,
yeah.
Did you first catch the guys and then they said? Or
no, so we could look at like the names they were going after, right? Like so I mean, you look by default, and you're like, oh, they're going after Dyn, but then you're like, oh, they only went after 6 IP addresses of them, their PlayStation IP addresses. Like, you start to figure out what's going on. When you talk to OVH and say, like, what protocols were running on these servers, and they say all of them are running Minecraft. You start to see these hints. Later on, these are all corroborated once they were arrested, but a lot of it is just taking these kind of hints along the way and trying to piece those together.
Clear after the
yeah, and so honestly, the weirdest part about this one was that, so we saw all of this, and we were just like, no way. Like, there's no way they just rented a random IP address themselves. They absolutely took over some vulnerable box and used that to launch their attacks. Because like, it didn't even cross our mind that like, you would do that, right? How would you not think you're not going to get caught if you use your credit card in the US to buy something from somewhere else in the US? And so we were just like, hey, we know about this, but it's probably useless to you. And that was actually our error, was we had all these suspicions of like actually even who the operators were, but we were so like just not confident about this. So we kind of provide this information as this very ad hoc, like, here's some things we found, but we don't want to like speculate too much. And then afterwards found out that actually no, like all of those kind of guesses along the way were all correct.
How is it that there are home routers that have admin logins from public IP addresses? I mean, I assume that large ISPs that are providing these routers to their clients have their customers have some sort of legal liability or?
Yeah, so actually the ISPs providing the home routers to users is actually a fairly new phenomenon. I mean, historically, they would kind of just give you a cable modem and you'd provide your own router. And that is how it is still in much of the world, where you get like an Ethernet connection to the world, and that's what you use. And so a lot of these are actually off-the-shelf purchased products. It's really only some of these really large ISPs. This actually started, I think, largely in Germany and France that we started to see ISPs mass producing and handing out these boxes to homes.
I was thinking of the French model.
Yeah, the French and Germany did this. In the US, it started to be picked up recently too, but we haven't seen it emerge in other parts of the world yet. Did you have a question too?
Yeah, I was wondering if you know what type of charges they will get for this.
Oh, they were charged. I don't remember the exact charges. My guess is something under, we have this law called the CFAA, which covers pretty much anything you could do to a computer, falls under it. It's a very vaguely written rule. I believe they were probably charged under that, and then probably also for the damages that they caused. There was financial harm to these companies as well.
Thank you.
All right, cool.